how do we use this information to change the medical establishment's view of how they approach medical cannabis? Because that's dangerous. If there's this much consensus and people are still not embracing it, then they're leaving tools on the table that could be used to improve people's lives.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Ryan Castle, Research Director at Whole Health Oncology Institute. Ryan, thanks for taking time. How are you doing today?
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
Excited to have you here. Kellen, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Really excited to talk to Ryan. How are you doing today, Brian?
Yeah, I'm stoked. We're going to talk about a little medical cannabis and maybe a little AI stuff, maybe dive into some of the elements that people have some perceptions on, might not be actually correct. But before we get into that, Ryan, would be really helpful. Can you give a quick background on yourself and how you found your way to the cannabis space?
Yeah, so I actually found my way to the cannabis space trying to prove that cannabis doesn't work. So my background is a public health researcher. And so I can do consulting work and people hire me to find out, okay, well, what are the facts and the truth behind different controversial ideas? That's what I specialize in, is really trying to dig into hard numbers. You know, when somebody says, well, it's complicated, I'm the person who tries to uncomplicate it. So I was hired by an organization to investigate medical cannabis, specifically cannabis and oncology. Its use in cancer. And I went into it and I had them sign all kinds of paperwork up and down saying, you may not like what I have to say because I'm going to tell you exactly what the science says, no matter what. And they signed off on it. And then I went in and I started doing the research. And my specialty is in public health applications and systems dynamics. And so that means that we look at as big a collection of data as we can get. And so I ended up putting together the largest set of studies on medical cannabis that have ever been done, and ended up discovering, to my surprise, that it not only works much, much more than anybody had thought, but ended up being groundbreakingly effective for a huge swath of things, that to the point where I came back to the folks who hired me and said, you know what, I was 100% wrong on this. Evidence changed my mind, and I would like to work with you guys on a more permanent basis going forward. That's where I am today.
So a couple high-level questions. One, what was your kind of perception going in? Was that some of these perceptions that people had just weren't data accurate? Or on the other side, let's say when you said works, right, when you were doing a big study to see if it works, was there a swath of saying pain or for nausea? Was there a specific segment that you were looking to attack, or was it just like anyone who's used cannabis in general for medicinal purposes?
So the study itself initially looked to capture medical cannabis across all genres. And so that's what we did. We actually have the background data for virtually every major symptom and condition out there. We have, is included over 10,000 papers, has over 800,000 data points, and the numbers start getting crazy when you start looking at the levels of analytics. But to answer your question, we specifically focused in on cancer, and we focused on cancer both in terms of symptoms and in terms of the cancer itself. And when you're asking, like, what did I mean by it works? That was exactly my question. Was I went into it assuming, like a lot of things, that placebo was going to be a very large part of this, that user assumptions were going to be a very large part of this. And honestly, that's the case with the majority of pharmacological interventions. The most drugs that the FDA approves are pretty close to placebo in terms of efficacy. It's really kind of surprising. But what we found with cannabis was that not only was the effect sizes in a lot of the studies that we were reading way higher than placebo, but we were finding that these rates of efficacy were showing up for pain. It was showing up for nausea. It was showing up for fatigue and for sleep. It was also showing up for tumor size, for tumor growth, for rates of remission and rates of the cancer returning afterwards. So we ended up finding it's not only something that was treating symptoms, it was actually treating the disease itself. And there's a huge range of topics that I could go down a deep rabbit hole on that about. But that was kind of where we started and where we ended up finding a consensus. Our study specifically was trying to look at this huge collection of studies and looking at what were the broad conclusions that each one of them found. So, for example, if there were 300 studies that looked at cannabis and, let's say, a cancer term, apoptosis, the cell death specifically of cancer cells while leaving healthy cells intact. Let's say there were 300 studies that kind of discussed that. We wanted to find out, okay, well, what percentage of them found a conclusion that they can report? And of that, what percentage of them were saying that the cannabis was effective versus what percentages were saying the cannabis was ineffective, or they simply couldn't tell? So that's where a lot of our stuff came down to, is, with such a large data set, we're not reporting, 17 patients, succeeded in their treatment goals. We're reporting, here are the really high level rates of success across the scientific field. Here are the points of consensus, and here are the points of disagreement within the scientific field, just based on sheer math and machine learning.
I guess to take it one step back, you went in skeptical, right? And at a certain point, the skepticism started to maybe waver a little bit, and you're like, well, maybe something's here. How early in that process, do you remember exactly when that moment was? And can you tell us about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I know exactly when it was, because it ended up me having to go and eat some crow in front of my employers. To be clear, I've never had anything against medical cannabis, but I am a scientist. I'm an ideological skeptic. So my take on it is, I don't believe anything until I have a reason to believe something. And then once I see the evidence, then I'll believe anything. So I went into this thinking, okay, I don't know. Maybe it'll be effective for a couple of things, but there's no way it's effective for all the things that I've heard it listed for. And I started digging into it and finding study after study after study. It was originally going to be a relatively small review, but I found out of the 15 papers that I initially looked at, 14 of them were saying cannabis was effective. And at least 5 of them were reporting direct effects on cancer cells. And that was really shocking. And that's not something you get with most pharmaceutical treatments. So I came back to them and said, here's the study results, but I don't feel comfortable with it. This is a really shocking finding, and it really goes against what we usually see in public health research. I'd like to look at a bigger collection and see, is this maybe just an unusual batch of studies? Let's look bigger. And they said, sure. We looked bigger, found pretty much the same thing. I said, I still feel uncomfortable because this is cancer. It's a really controversial topic. You don't want to mess around with people who are making decisions that, can be life and death. Let's go bigger. And we ended up going back and forth until we decided to do the biggest meta-analysis on medical cannabis ever done. And that's where we are now. Because I couldn't get any larger of a collection to make myself feel comfortable. So we got every applicable study that we could find and put it into this. Over 10,000 different studies collected on this. And then finally I came back and said, okay, once we've reviewed everything that exists, I think I have to be satisfied.
So this study's published, right? You guys published it. It's available on the NIH website.
Yes.
And so can you kind of walk us through and our listeners through exactly what that study, when you say meta-analysis, right? You're talking about the science. They did a scientific study, whether on a individual or on cell lines, right? There was either some sort of positive outcome, essentially, right? Is that what you're kind of pulling out of each study? And that's what the data set is? Can you walk our listeners through that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are several different tiers of evidence that people put out, and they all fall under the umbrella of research. There are things that are just sort of a review of existing work. There are clinical trials where people are actually actively giving the person a treatment of some kind and testing the result. There are double-blind studies where they don't know whether or not the group has received the treatment or not. You're testing against placebo or null. All of these are sort of one-off collections of data. You get some information here, some information there. Sometimes they're comparable, but usually they're very standalone. the highest level of analysis in research are systematic reviews and meta-analyses, which is what we did. And that's where you are not conducting the individual research with a collection of 10 people, 20 people, 100 people. You are analyzing the findings of every one of the studies that had 10 people, 20 people, 100 people, so that, for example, the estimate of the number of patients that all told were captured in our analysis is somewhere on the order of 50,000. And that is what we use to try to determine what is the overall direction that science is taking. Because people will always say, like, oh, you can find a study for anything. And for better and worse, that can be true. That's what systematic reviews and meta-analyses are there for. Is our job is to look at all of them and say, yeah, you found a study that supports this one opinion, but there's one study that supports that opinion and 99 studies that support the other opinion. And so there's where the evidence lies. And that's what we did for medical cannabis, is we tried to see, like, okay, out of 10,000 studies, how many are actually in support of it for, a whole range of different symptoms and diseases versus how many are saying it shouldn't be used. And there's a whole bunch of minutia that breaks down from that as well statistically. But that's kind of what we were doing, is trying to figure out, how do we get away from this, cherry picking of studies? So everybody's got their own pet study that they can, wave up in the air. And then the next person says, oh, I have this other study funded by this group, and I have the study funded by that group. We did not exclude any study from either side, no matter what the viewpoint was. We included everything that was critical of cannabis. We included everything that was supportive cannabis. So we deliberately tried to go in there with as little human bias as we could. We built custom-made machine learning systems to identify what studies to include, to identify what the conclusions were based on keywords and the sentences people were using to describe the effects, so that we could get our own bias out of the way, so that we couldn't deliberately kind of put our finger on the scale and be like, well, I think this one is worth a little bit more. It was completely out of our hands. It's a pure statistical analysis, so that we can say, yeah, this is a pretty close approximation of what the medical community is showing, what the scientific community is showing in terms of research.
As a non-scientist, I'm just going to ask probably a bad question, but going in, there's so many varying factors, right? There's the gender, there's their weight, there's the formulation, there's the feeling, right? How are all of those factors influenced throughout that to feel comfortable saying that, like, medical cannabis is good for X, right? Like, I think that becomes the challenge when you're laying all those out, is like, there's all these factors, endocannabinoid system. Where does it stop, and where do you say, okay, we feel good with these factors for these credentials?
Yeah. And that is one of the biggest hurdles. And we started out with nearly 40,000 data sets that we were working with, and got down to 10,000 by excluding everything that didn't have clear-cut data that could be analyzed. Because there are a really large collection of studies where they'll say something along the lines, oh yeah, we examined three guys who are college-age males, and we found that all of them love cannabis. So it looks like everybody loves cannabis. It's like, okay, well, obviously there's a lot of methodological problems right there.
But also true.
So, also true, but
based on their observations.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing. That's where the meta-analysis comes in handy. Because I don't say that the people who are cherry picking one study versus another, I don't think the people that wrote some of these studies that are being, waved around to, justify kind of fringe opinions, I don't think the people who wrote those studies had bad faith. I think that they wrote the study that reported the facts that they found. But the facts that one small group of people find are not always, in fact, not usually indicative of the entire field that you're trying to explore. You've got to look at the bigger picture to be able to find out, where is the actual direction of the scientific consensus moving? And is it for something, or is it in refutation of something? And in this case, we found that overall consensus was overwhelmingly in support of medical cannabis.
the factors are just so endless, right? I'm just thinking about my dad who sometimes take cannabis for pain, and his pain scale, like the 1 to 10 is a subjective number, right? That he's giving. And sometimes the edible helps and sometimes it doesn't. And there's probably varying levels of maybe this specific time, or maybe he ate something. And these are all the different levels that I'm thinking through when you're trying to understand, like, because you're right, like with cancer, it's such a strong indictment saying, hey, this makes a big difference. People are going to have all these other levels. So for you to come in skeptical and to feel overwhelmingly positive is a substantial findings that you must have felt going through that, and probably being skeptical throughout the process, being like, I know the data says this, but I'm still not sure and convinced that it's accurate enough for what we're looking for.
Yeah. And that was really what it came down to, was I really do believe that the more extraordinary the claim, the more extraordinary the evidence required. And this is something that went against a large collection of institutional advice. There's a lot of large-scale organizations, which, to be fair, also receive federal funding, and so therefore there's a lot of caveats that come with their motivations for why they might say a given position on cannabis. But there, one way or the other, are a lot of organizations say no, we don't sign off on medical cannabis. And you can't just look at, well, like my buddy's, uncle, my sister used cannabis and it really worked for her, so this must be effective. That's one of the things that, I have a lot of people come to me and say, oh, well, I knew this worked a long time ago because, it worked for, my brother when he got sick with such and such. I'm like, I'm really glad that it did. That's fantastic. That's what we want to see. And personal stories are not the same thing as evidence. There are ways you can make it that way. You can work that into surveys with the patient and get them to, fill out specific surveys and forms and describe their experiences. And that's what's called a patient-reported outcome. Those are great. But most people, when they're chatting with their friends, are not like, okay, so I need you to fill out this form every week on Monday after 4 p.m. I need you to fill this out, and then we can chat about how well cannabis worked for you. Like that's not usually a conversation starter. So that's really one of the reasons why we felt this was necessary, is to try to get that big picture, to make it so people didn't either have to trust, cherry-picked studies or hearsay. There should be a bigger picture where we can look at, what does science say? What does the overall consensus around science say? And consensus is a dangerous word in the scientific world. So, I don't blame people if they get angry about me using that term. But I feel like when you have looked at as big a collection as we did, and we found a consensus for cannabis that was 31 times greater than the collection of people opposing it out of those research studies. That's not a number that you see in just about any other form of pharmaceutical intervention. Like, there aren't a lot of things outside of, penicillin that have those kinds of numbers.
Right?
Oh, wow.
Sorry.
Timely. Major breaking news.
I said penicillin. The first thing that popped in my head is it's consensus around Thailand.
There it goes.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that was great. That was really well timed and very timely. That was really impressive.
Is there other correlations from this large data set when you guys did the meta-analysis? 31 times greater support for the use of it and positive outcomes with every different form factor. And I know that people can get stuck in the weeds debating strains or dosage or what it's actually treating, if it's treating the symptoms of chemotherapy, or if it's actually creating apoptosis, right, and causing cell death. But was there other nuanced items that you guys were able to pull out of this from a meta standpoint that kind of help wash away all of those other conversations that people can get trapped in?
Yeah, absolutely. And breaking those things down, that's a really good breakdown of the issues that a lot of people bring up in terms of it's just people like it because it helped with the symptoms of chemo, but it wasn't actually treating the cancer, or it made people not feel the pain as much. And that's all. It's just masking the issues. And we broke this down in our study. We have over, I think, 200 different individual data points of examining everything from overall chemotherapy to down to the individual symptoms of appetite issues, nausea, pain, sleeplessness. And then we get down in all the way, if you want to get real into the weeds, we get into the biomarkers of the actual cancer. So we can talk about the tumor size, we can talk about cancer growth and cancer remission. And then we get all the way down into, the tumor necrosis factors, and we start looking at inflammatory markers, and we start looking at rescissions, and we really tried to include enough information so that if somebody at a glance wanted to take a look at it, they can see, oh, okay, in terms of I'm only interested in chemotherapy, oh yeah, there's a 65% greater support for chemotherapy or for cancer or cannabis with chemotherapy than there is against it.
When you say support, let's just lay that up, right? That means 65% of the people in your study felt benefits versus not.
Technically, we're not looking at the individual people within the individual studies for the exact reason of there are so many complicating factors. So what we're looking at are actually the conclusions of each of those individual studies. So out of, say, those 10,000 studies, we were finding that approximately 65% of them that discussed chemotherapy said that chemotherapy was supported with cannabis, that cannabis helped chemotherapy symptoms in their study. Whatever their study may have been, their study may have included 5 people, it may have included 500 people, but we were looking at the consensus of the individual studies and finding what did they say. So that's what we mean when we say that. And when we talk about, getting into the nitty gritty of it, for example, TNF alpha, and we found overwhelming majority of the studies that mentioned TNF alpha, which is that's a biomarker test that is done to see how badly somebody's inflammatory system is dysregulated, which happens a lot both with chemotherapy and unfortunately with cancer. And the consensus was overwhelmingly in support of cannabis, to the point where when we applied our statistical filters to sort of take out studies that don't fit within, they don't meet a certain threshold of significance, it was unparalleled in a lot of these areas, specifically around inflammation, pain, symptoms. It was kind of just across the board, the study consensus was for medical cannabis without a significant body of the scientific world saying, no, it doesn't work. And that, again, that's something that is pretty surprising to find. And hence the reason why we ran the numbers, 8 or 9 times.
Is it all forms of cancer?
No, that's something that's interesting. I shouldn't say not all forms of cancer, but not all of the results came back uniform. So there were some instances where we would see cannabis not showing a strong improvement rate. Like, for example, one of the ones that I thought was very interesting was specifically clinician-reported remission. So that's when the doctor is reporting follow-up, saying, oh yeah, the patient came back and they're completely cancer-free, or the patient came back and their cancer came right back with them. And we didn't find a relationship at all that we could determine in terms of cannabis from this study. And that was really kind of interesting, given all of the other things. We saw shrinking tumor sizes, we saw reducing rates of people getting cancer. And so that actually led to one of our follow-up projects that we did, where we started trying to reach out directly to the patients. Because one of the problems with things like remission is that's a follow-up. The doctor has to get in touch with the patient, or the patient has to come back to the doctor and let them know, yeah, it came back, or no, yeah, it's been a year and I'm completely cancer-free. So we actually started a large project called the Patient Reported Outcome Hub, where we're trying to put out and gather as many patient-reported outcomes as we can, longitudinally get people to report, here's what I went through, here's the experiences I had, here's the medical cannabis I had, here's the disease that I contracted, my symptoms, all that stuff. All that stuff that, it makes for a good conversation at dinner. And we're trying to find out, okay, well, what do those gaps in the research, if clinical science can't report on it, maybe the patients can fill in that gap. And we found a really large percentage that were very interesting on that. A large percentage of the patients who reported having cancer and using medical cannabis reported going into remission earlier than anticipated. And when asked, did you follow up with your doctor? The vast majority said no, because they didn't approve of me using medical cannabis. And that's one of those things that I like to say is a confounder. That's in a study. These are one of those things that clinicians and researchers don't think about, of a potential explanation for why did these numbers on this one item sort of show the opposite trend of everything else. Part of it could be, and again, I'm not saying this is what the study found. This is what we have seen in other data that we found elsewhere. But a possible explanation could be the fact that a lot of the patients for whom it worked really, really well were kind of disillusioned with the process of the medical system and its approach to medical cannabis. And so they just didn't report the remission. So that's an interesting area there. And that's something that we've been exploring as well in terms of trying to figure out ways, how do we use this information to change the medical establishment's view of how they approach medical cannabis? Because that's dangerous. If there's this much consensus and people are still not embracing it, then they're leaving tools on the table that could be used to improve people's lives. And that's something we hope to change.
I think that's like the most powerful thing so far, right? Is that this is a tool that could help people. And if doctors whose role is to try to explore all the options in front of them, then how do we kind of tighten up the pipes between the doctors and some of the research so that they get a better understanding that, hey, maybe this information wasn't as widely known previously, but now new findings have come out, and sometimes new facts are hard and changes people's minds. So how do we help shift that narrative so when you present in front of a doctor and he's like, hey, here are all the options, including the ones that previously I wasn't considering, how do we help change that conversation?
The way I like to say it is, if you want to reach a group of people, you have to speak the language that they understand. And that goes for, if I move to Spain and I don't speak any Spanish, I'm not going to get very far trying to explain medical cannabis to the random person. If I'm talking to a researcher or a medical director and I am using, personal experiences or anecdotes, they're just going to nod politely and then ignore everything that you say. You have to speak the language that they understand. And that's science, that's data, that's hard numbers, that's statistics, that's efficacy rates and odds ratios, all of the different terms that they understand and that they look for. And unfortunately, that's one of the areas where there hasn't been as concerted a push in the world of medical cannabis. And that's what we're trying to remedy. We're trying to do that in a couple of different ways. One, are research papers like this, that we're really grateful for the traction this one got. We got somewhere around 100,000 different downloads by scientific and medical organizations, over 500 million reads around the world. And it got enough attention that I think that there's going to be an impact made in the medical world. But you got to give people tools. And that's one of the things we're trying to do as follow-ups to this. So we're trying to put together things like the Patient-Reported Outcome Hub or the Pro Hub to be able to give doctors the opportunity of okay, if you aren't sure about it, why don't you use this set of tools so that you can survey your own patient group and just say, yeah, if you want to use medical cannabis, that's great. Let me work with you and track it. So day by day, I can see how you're doing, see how your symptoms are doing as being reported back to me live. And I can see, oh no, they're having a huge drop. This was a terrible decision. Or, oh, symptoms are improving week after week. Maybe this is something I should consider for the rest of my patients. And then the other tool we're putting together is a custom-built AI suite to try to answer exactly those questions, whether to lay people and just kind of explain and break down for them what does the science say, or to clinicians and give them the vetted, complete data on the science behind medical cannabis.
Before we get into AI stuff, because I'm definitely interested in picking your brain on that, I wanna ask you to be on the other side of the table, put your skeptical hat back on, and look at the study, right, as one of these skepticisms. Is there a gap, or is there an area where if you were a skeptic, you'd say this right here, there's not enough for me to feel comfortable on, and where would that be?
Yeah, absolutely. You're describing pretty much the process I go through as soon as I share the paper with the rest of my co-authors. Everybody comes back with just ripping it to shreds and is redlined to all get out. But the things that I would say, if I were being critical of this, is you don't have effect sizes. And that means not just did something have an effect, did a study say it worked, yes or no, but how much did it work? And if you don't have an effect size, if you're not able to gauge, well, did it improve patient outcomes by 1% or 1,000%? Then it's hard to estimate, okay, well, what is going to be the impact if we implement this across the board? Another area I would probably tear apart would be just the statistics of it. Statistics are finicky, and somebody could try to go in and reassess this in a different way, run a completely different set of metrics. We tried to do our best to proof against that. So we actually ran our own data through two completely different types of analysis, two completely different sets of mathematics to see if they lined up. And they did. But I'm sure if I was really determined to debunk this, I could find a statistical method that would break it down. And then finally, the last one would be to just attack the people who are involved and say, well, okay, this is a person who is employed by an organization that published the paper. So therefore, he's going to want to try to publish, stuff that is going to make them happy. And, to that, I can share, contract statements and, ethical clauses all day long. But, if somebody believes that a person's operating in bad faith, they're going to believe that. My answer to all of those things would be, this is an open access paper. We deliberately published the paper, all of the data, all of the methodology, all of the stats, all of the raw numbers publicly, so that if anybody wants to go in there and debunk us, please. We want to have the best science available. So if you can find a way to break it, it should be broken.
No, I appreciate that, right? And that was going to be my follow-up question, because I think that's the transparency element where sometimes people hear these new facts and their immediate assumption is, this is different than I currently feel. So my first feeling is I'm just going to reject it. And to accept this new facts requires an openness, which sometimes is very difficult. And for doctors, I can't speak on their behalf, but I can assume is probably a lot of information coming in, because for a long time they learned one thing and now here's this overwhelming evidence that comes another. But then my thought comes to, from a governmental standpoint, like if this is just the beginning, what could happen if we explored this even further? If we put real funding resources toward this and we opened this up more, where we included all the other resources that you might have been constrained on for this current project, if we helped with some of these elements, how much bigger could the pool size be, where we could go through some of those disbeliefs that you had and say, okay, well, this was the problem and now we've checked that box?
I mean, I would say that's what we're hoping for. We're hoping that people who are able to decide on policy, people who are able to put their finger on the scale of the direction that the medical establishment turns, are going to see this, are going to see the consensus, are going to see the evidence and decide to support it and decide to see, okay, well, it looks like the evidence is pretty solidly that it should help, and there's almost no evidence showing that it would harm. So let's give it a spin. And I can just say, you're asking what might happen. The last time that there was this large of a scientific support, medical support behind a treatment that hadn't been implemented or wasn't widespread was right before the abolishment of polio. So I feel like you want to take a look at what happens when, I'm not saying, because this isn't a vaccine, but that was a situation where we had a really widespread disease, a really serious problem that was throughout the country. And we didn't have a clear-cut way of dealing with it, but there was a lot of science that was showing, okay, here's a vaccine that could work for it. Here's a treatment that could work for it. We have a huge amount of information behind this, but it's going to require a big step. It's going to require a really dramatic step of requiring this huge participation of the entire country. But they did that then, and millions of lives were saved. Hundreds of millions of lives were changed. And I feel like that's a place that we find ourselves right now, in terms of there are an untold number of lives that could be impacted by the decision to make this medication available, more freely available to people. You know, say what you will about the entire industry. That's not my field. But in terms of medical cannabis, there are millions of lives that could be impacted and improved, just statistically speaking, by taking a different approach to it as a medicine.
So let's play, you have a magic wand, money and ethics, no issue. What would be the study that you would conduct here in order to take the next step?
What I would want to do would be something called a health impact assessment. And it's something I've done for smaller projects. For something like this, it would be a large scale endeavor, but it takes a look at every layer of the consequences of a change.
Explain large scale, just so we have context.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example of another health impact assessment that I did. We worked on a health impact assessment for an intervention, a treatment that improved heart rate variability, which is just sort of the heart's ability to, when it speeds up, to slow back down, and vice versa. And, that's relevant to more than just being able to go jogging when you want it. It's also a big predictor of heart attacks and heart disease and a whole bunch of things. And we had found a relatively small treatment that was able to improve heart rate variability by, I think it was 5 or 10%. And when we mapped it out, we said, okay, how many people might this affect if it got implemented? A lot of people have really bad heart issues. Okay, what would be the immediate effect of that? Okay, well, it's going to decrease their chances of heart attack. Okay, what would be the secondary effect of that? Okay, well, then they're not going to be getting medical bills. They're going to be putting a burden on their family and also on their employer and the economy. Okay, well, what would be the third degree of effect? Okay, well, then you're going to be having fewer bankruptcies, fewer desperation, increase in quality of life, and the ability to continue to provide for their family for a longer period of time. And that has a whole bunch of ripple effects. So that's, you look at something like that and you can say, okay, well, we changed this one thing for heart rate variability. And over the course of 10 years, we could save 20,000 lives, improve the lives of, something like 300,000 people, and save people a cumulative $18 million. For just this collection of people who use it. So that's an example of a health impact assessment for a really small, really niche treatment. For something like medical cannabis, which can affect everything from cancer rates, cancer development, cancer recovery, inflammation, which is the number one predictor of virtually every chronic disease that is out there. If we have a large-scale rollout of medical cannabis as an available treatment, then I think the health impact assessment that we're looking at is going to be mind-blowing in terms of the number of people whose lives are saved, the number of people whose lives are positively impacted. They may not have died, but they may have lived the rest of their life in pain or discomfort or sleeplessness or what have you. And especially the amount of money that people would be saving from not having to rely on less efficient and much more expensive, for example, opioid medications to deal with their pain or other problems. And I think that would be what I would wave my wand and have done, because I suspect you're going to be seeing millions of lives, billions of dollars, and a very different world.
The skeptic in me is excited about that, but wonders that those big companies, those large-scale companies with those opioid medicine, probably doesn't want those large-scale revenue streams to go away. So I would wonder if they wouldn't be in favor of studies that would offer an alternative, unless there was an opportunity for them to be in front of this. But that is just me from a skeptical standpoint.
I have to be careful in terms of what I say about any given person or group's motivations. I will simply observe that when the DEA opened up their discussion about rescheduling cannabis, there was a huge swath of studies that suddenly popped up out of nowhere saying cannabis did everything from causes people to just spontaneously have heart attacks to, it caused cancer all the way down the line. A lot of the studies had some pretty bonkers methodology. Like we talk about stuff that wouldn't have made the cut in our analysis. That's one of them. Like, for example, one of the studies said, well, we've concluded cannabis causes heart disease and heart attacks. And the way we know that is we did a telephone study where we interviewed, like 100 survivors of heart attacks. And, nearly 80% of them said that they used medical cannabis. They didn't ask, did you start using the medical cannabis after you had the heart attack to deal with the pain of the recovery? Or did you use the cannabis long before you had the heart attack? So that's one of my favorites of a lot of studies like that of kind of similar quality popped up right when the DEA went to reschedule. And when you trace back the funding behind the vast majority of those studies, you find a certain group of interests. I'll just leave it at that are along the lines of what you're saying. And
the chain's pretty clear, right? Like you look at that and you're like, that's kind of odd. Oh, this is the group that helped that. Well, that doesn't totally surprise me and shock me, but I think that kind of goes, no, it's not so odd. And it actually kind of makes sense, right? Because if you were them, you're like, well, we don't want this. And how do we not want this? Well, this information is pretty good. And it's like, hey, like.
That's actually one of the things we got some of the bigger pushback on our, just on terms of a private area, was we actually found a large block of our study and was around pain. And we did a level of analysis comparing other treatments for pain with medical cannabis. And we found that there were a number of studies showing medical cannabis had comparable efficacy in terms of pain relief to a lot of leading opioids, with a huge reduction in, with almost no side effects that, bear the name. Yeah, the side effects for the cannabis was, filling a little bit out of it. Whereas the side effects for the opioids were life-threatening bowel obstructions, crippling addiction, and, so a wide range of issues. And so we pointed out in the study, like, and also we found, this extra layer of analysis showed that patients who used cannabis and opioids were dramatically more likely to quit using opioids than people who just used opioids. So we actually found that, if anything, the cannabis was an anti-gateway drug. It was helping people get off of other harder drugs during treatment. And that was something we got a number of very polite conversations saying, are you sure you want to put that in the paper? So there's interests involved, and everybody's got to do what they got to do.
What about from a rescheduling standpoint? Can you speak on that? Have you been contacted? Can you submit this information? Because this would be pretty favorable when they're looking for medical research, right? It's one of the criteria they're looking for. And one of the challenges is with the way it's scheduled currently, makes it difficult to do the research. But if the research has already been done, then receiving the information, reviewing it should essentially be easier. Is that something you can share with us?
Exactly. Absolutely. That's something we're really proud of. We worked with the Cannabis Coalition to submit the evidence of our research to the DEA for their rescheduling. When they opened it up for comments, for public comments to assess the weight of the evidence for and against cannabis, we worked with Cannabis Coalition to submit all of the information, all the findings, broken down statistics, step by step, weighing everything from efficacy to danger to addictiveness to prevalence, all these things. And I'm really proud of the fact that we were able to be the largest collection of evidence in support of cannabis that was submitted during the rescheduling discussion. And at the time, they were going to take it under advisement, and they said, you should expect, a rescheduling to Schedule 3, which means it's allowed to be researched scientifically, could be used medically. within a month or two. That obviously didn't happen. There was a change in leadership with the DEA, and a lot of things went in a different direction. But we're still hopeful that the evidence is going to win out, because that stuff is submitted. The stuff is logged in the record with the DEA. If you go to the DEA's rescheduling comment section, you can find our evidence in there. And this is stuff that is available to the government. It's available to the scientific world. It's available to the public. Anybody can check it out, can test it, see if it makes sense to them. And we hope that people will, because I looked at this data 100 different ways, and I can't find any other way to look at it other than this is something that should be medically available.
Boom. Major powerful. So last question, tell us about the Cancer Playbook.
Yeah, so Cancer Playbook is a nonprofit project that we operate with. And the goal with that is try to give cancer patients the opportunity to share their story, share their experiences, and then get the benefits of sort of this large scale data. Not just this study specifically, but we've also put together a huge collection of patient-reported outcomes, scientific studies, everything on just about every facet of oncology, whole health treatments, and medical cannabis. So somebody logs on to cancerplaybook.org and they can partake in the survey just as, okay, well, here's who I am, here's my information, here's the symptoms, my disease, and so on. And it will kick back to them a cutting edge breakdown of, okay, well, for your disease, these types of cannabis have actually been shown to be most effective. These terpenes are really effective at treating this particular symptom. For your disease type, let's say you're dealing with ovarian cancer, here's the rate of success for patients who didn't use medical cannabis. Here's the rate of success for patients who did use medical cannabis. And you can decide from there. Here's, stories from the patients of how they used it. So it's not medical advice. We're not trying to put our own view out there. We're putting out third-party evidence, and we're putting out patient stories to help people make their own decisions about what works best for their cancer journey. And that's at cancerplaybook.org. And that's 100% free for people just to try to give themselves some resources to make better decisions, to, take to their doctor, to, say, okay, does this work? Does this science look right to you? Because we have the patient stories, and we also have behind every single statement are also scientific citations, facts, and statistics.
Awesome. Well, appreciate that. So for our listeners, they want to get in touch and they want to learn more, where else can they find you?
So there's cancerplaybook.org, and that's where I run research operations. And then there is wholehealthoncology.com. And that's the organization that I am the president of. And that's where we do the scientific operations and the, sort of the high level clinical work. Cancer Playbook is where we try to interact directly with the patients.
Awesome. We'll link it up in the show notes. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Take care.